Hello. My name's Sadie. When my grandfather passed, he left behind land, businesses, money, but not for me. He left me a rusted-out truck that barely held together, and when the will was read, my sister laughed, right there, in front of everyone. They all did. But what if that rust-covered truck held something no one saw coming? What if it was never junk, but a message? A secret only I was meant to uncover. Why would Grandpa give me something everyone else thought was worthless? And what happens when the one they tried to erase becomes the one they can't ignore? I still remember that gray morning like a bruise that never faded. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies, the kind florists set out when grief has to be dressed up in perfume. I sat in the second pew, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, the weight of silence pressing down on me. Grandpa was gone, and I thought the hardest part of this week would be lowering him into the ground. I was wrong. The attorney cleared his throat as he unfolded the will. His voice was measured, practiced, as though he had read thousands before this one. He listed off the properties, rental homes, farmland, a handful of stocks, each name tied neatly to a relative. Heads nodded, satisfied murmurs rolled through the room. Then he paused, his eyes flicking to me. To Sadie, he said, he leaves the 1979 Ford F-150, non-operational, currently stored in the barn. The room went still for a moment. Then I heard it. Seraphine's laugh. It wasn't just a chuckle. It was sharp, bright, cutting through the solemn air like glass shattering. Figures, she said, pressing a manicured hand to her chest as if she couldn't contain herself. She gets junk. A ripple of laughter followed. My uncle shook his head, cousins exchanged looks, someone behind me muttered, "Well, that sounds about right." I sat frozen, every nerve in my body screaming to get up and walk out. Instead, I stared at the polished shoes of the attorney, trying to anchor myself to something steady. My cheeks burned, but I forced my face to stay blank. If I let them see the humiliation, they'd take it as confirmation that I deserved it. When the reading ended, people rose slowly, whispering in small groups, some shaking their heads at the unfairness, others smirking as if justice had been served. I didn't remember standing, but suddenly I was on my feet, my palms damp, my throat tight. Later that evening, Seraphine hosted the family at her house, a sprawling two-story with glass windows and white columns. I went only because I didn't want my absence to give them another excuse to say I didn't belong. The living room was filled with chatter and the sound of glasses clinking. I stood near the doorway, clutching a cup of water, overhearing scraps of conversation. "Sadie's inheritance," one cousin laughed. "Hope she knows how to tow." "Maybe she'll open a scrapyard," another chimed in. My phone buzzed. I looked down and saw the family group chat lighting up. There it was, a photo of Grandpa's truck, rust streaking the sides, one wheel sagging into the dirt. Seraphine had snapped it and posted it with the caption, "Our little sister's grand inheritance. Junkyard Queen." Laughing emojis filled the screen. Thumbs up signs, sarcastic claps. My chest tightened. I placed the cup on the nearest table and slipped out before anyone could notice. The air outside was cool, but it didn't soothe the heat rising under my skin. I climbed into my old sedan and drove away. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark. And with every mile, the weight in my chest grew heavier. I had always been the overlooked one, the youngest, the one people patted on the head, told to keep quiet, told I'd never carry weight in this family. Grandpa was the only person who saw me differently. He'd hand me a wrench, let me crawl under the truck with him, tell me I had steady hands. Now I wondered if even he had seen me as a joke. Had that old truck been a mistake, or was it his way of saying I was worth nothing? I pulled into my driveway and shut off the car. The house was too quiet without him. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, tears sliding down before I could stop them. I pressed my forehead against the cool leather, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. The next morning, I drove back to the family estate. The sky was pale blue, sunlight breaking through thin clouds. The gravel crunched under my tires as I parked near the porch. Seraphine was already outside, leaning back in a chair, coffee cup in hand. Her silk robe shimmered in the light, her nails painted the color of blood roses. She smiled at me, a slow, mocking curve of her lips. "Here for the keys?" she asked, tilting her head. She didn't wait for my answer. Hope you enjoy sleeping in that truck. I stood at the bottom of the steps, forcing my hands to stay at my sides. My breath caught, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reply. She dangled the keys between her fingers for a moment, then tossed them lightly toward me. They jingled as they landed in my palm. My hand trembled, but I tightened my grip. I turned without a word and walked back toward the barn. Behind me, I heard her laugh again, softer this time, but no less cruel. The barn doors creaked as I pulled them open. Dust swirled in the beams of light that filtered through the slats, and there it was, the truck. Its once blue paint eaten by rust, tires sagging, windshield clouded. I stood there, staring, the laughter of my family still echoing in my ears. They thought they'd buried me under rust, turned me into a punchline. But as I stepped closer, running my hand along the rough metal, something stirred inside me. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something that didn't feel like defeat. That night, as I stood in front of Grandpa's truck for the first time, I felt every eye rolling, every laugh echoing in my chest. But I also felt something else, something none of them could see. It wasn't just the weight of their laughter I carried when I walked out of that barn. It was the way it clung to my skin like smoke. By the time I got back to my place, I couldn't even bring myself to go inside. My hands still trembled from holding the truck keys, so I just sat in my car for a while, staring at nothing. I didn't sleep that night. Around 5 in the morning, when the sky hadn't decided yet if it wanted to be dawn or stay dark, I packed a single duffel with clothes for me and Micah, my son. Tossed in a pillow, 2 blankets, and a picture frame I didn't even have the nerve to look at. We didn't have much to begin with. There wasn't much to take. I drove to a strip of forgotten pavement behind an old grocery store off Route 66. The building had been boarded up for years, but the lot was still open, still quiet. The truck sat there waiting, as rusted and tired as I felt. I parked beside it, cut the engine, and sat in silence. Micah stirred in the back seat. "You okay, Mom?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, baby. We're just taking a little break. That okay with you?" He nodded, still half asleep. I didn't tell him we weren't going back to the apartment. I didn't tell him his aunt had laughed me out of the will and the family. He'd find out soon enough, and I needed just a few more hours where he could feel like a kid. By noon, I'd moved everything we had into the truck. It smelled like mildew and grease and something else, something old and metallic that had seeped into the fabric of the cracked leather seats. I wiped down what I could, tossed a blanket over the back bench, and made a little nest for Micah to sleep in. He watched me work with wide, quiet eyes, like he was trying to understand without asking too many questions. That night, the wind made the truck creak in places I didn't know it could move. The cold snuck through the gaps in the windows. I wrapped Micah in both blankets, tucked the picture frame under the seat, and sat awake with my coat zipped all the way up, staring through the windshield at the grocery store's boarded-up sign. "How low can they push me?" I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. Nobody answered. The next day, I scraped together what little change I had left in my wallet and walked to the convenience store 2 blocks down. Micah stayed behind, drawing with his finger on the fogged-up window. The clerk didn't look at me when I paid with quarters and nickels for 2 packets of ramen noodles and a pack of gum. I thanked him anyway. As I stepped outside, I heard the purr of an engine too smooth to be from anywhere near here. A white Range Rover pulled up next to the truck. Of course it was her. Seraphine rolled down her window, sunglasses on, blonde hair pulled tight like she was heading to a fundraiser, not stalking me on the edge of a parking lot. "Well, look at this," she said, voice sweet as syrup. "Home sweet home, huh? Maybe you can rent it out to raccoons when you're not using it." I stared at her, my hands tightening around the paper bag. I didn't say a word. Micah's face appeared behind the passenger window. He looked down at his feet as soon as he saw her. Seraphine's smile widened like she'd scored a point. "Tell your son to keep the windows rolled up. Wouldn't want him catching something from all that rust." She sped off before I could respond. Not that I would've. My silence was all I had left, that she hadn't mocked. Back in the truck, Micah didn't say anything at first. He sat in the corner with his arms wrapped around his knees, staring out. "Is she right?" he asked eventually. "Are we living here now?" I sat down next to him, handed him a warm cup of ramen, and brushed a hand over his messy hair. Just for a little while. Till things get better. He nodded, but I saw it in his eyes, that flicker of embarrassment, not at me, at our situation, and that hurt more than any insult his aunt could throw. The next morning, I walked him to school. We didn't talk much on the way. I hugged him before he walked through the doors, told him to keep his head up, reminded him how smart and kind he was. He gave me a half-hearted smile and disappeared into the building. That afternoon, he climbed into the truck with slumped shoulders and glassy eyes. What happened? He shook his head. Nothing. Micah. He hesitated, then said it fast, like ripping off a Band-Aid. Some kids said you live in trash. They said you sleep in a junkyard. I stared at him, my hands frozen around the thermos I was holding. And what did you say? Nothing. I didn't know what to say. I didn't answer right away. I pulled him close and held him, resting my cheek on his head. He didn't cry. He just let out a shaky breath, like a balloon slowly leaking air. It's one thing for them to laugh at me. I've had decades of practice with that. But to see it bleed onto my son, to see the shame they'd painted on me start staining him, that I could not forgive. That night, after I made sure Micah was asleep, I sat behind the wheel of Grandpa's truck. My fingers traced the rim of the steering wheel, the ridges smooth from years of use. I thought about all the times I sat beside him, watching him drive with one hand, humming old country songs. My tears came quiet, steady. Not because I was sad, not really, but because I'd finally stopped feeling numb. I won't let them define us, I whispered. Not me, not him. And just like that, something shifted. I looked out at the empty lot, the cracked pavement, the sky folding into black above us. They thought this truck was my coffin, but I decided it would be my weapon. Micah was still sleeping when I stepped out of the truck the next morning. His small body was curled up in the back seat, his head resting against a pillow that had lost most of its fluff. The air was cool and damp, and the sky above Tulsa wore that familiar pale gray, the kind that didn't promise rain, but couldn't commit to sunshine either. I needed to move. I needed to do something with my hands before my thoughts swallowed me whole. So I grabbed the sponge I'd found yesterday near the dumpster, crusty but still intact, and a half-empty bottle of dish soap from my duffel bag. I filled an old coffee can with water from the hose behind the building and knelt beside the truck, starting with the passenger side door. The rust flaked off in uneven patches, some pieces falling like burnt paper. I didn't have a goal, not really. Maybe I just wanted to see something clean, something I could fix, something that didn't look like it belonged in a junkyard or in a family's inside joke. That's when I saw it. The sponge caught on a jagged edge just beneath the handle. I leaned in, squinting. What I thought was more rust looked different. It didn't crumble like the others. The surface underneath wasn't dull, but instead had a warm, muted glow, just enough to catch the morning light. My heart thudded. I blinked, wiped again. It shimmered. I dropped the sponge, my breath catching halfway up my throat. No, it couldn't be. But there it was again, a thin line, maybe the width of 2 fingers, glinting softly under the rust. Not paint, not chrome. This had weight, this had color, the kind you didn't see on old metal. The kind that wasn't supposed to be here. I reached for the edge with my thumbnail, scraping carefully. More flakes came off, revealing a smooth patch underneath. No corrosion, no pits, just dense golden sheen. Not yellow paint, not brass. I knew that color. My fingers knew it. My grandfather's old coin jar had looked just like this. Is this? I whispered, not daring to finish the question out loud. I looked around the lot. Empty. Just cracked asphalt and a row of dumpsters leaning like tired soldiers. I glanced back at the truck. Was this why Grandpa left it to me? Had he known what was hidden beneath? And if so, why not just tell me? That night, after Micah had drifted off to sleep again, I sat quietly behind the wheel, the small golden patch still hidden beneath a piece of duct tape I'd placed over it. I needed to be sure I wasn't losing it, needed someone who could tell me this wasn't just wishful thinking wrapped in grief and desperation. I didn't want to involve anyone, especially not anyone who still talked to Seraphine, but there was one person I could trust. Calder. He'd worked alongside Grandpa for nearly 2 decades, ran the body shop down on Jennings Avenue before retiring. I hadn't seen him in years, not since the family started icing me out. But if anyone knew what Grandpa was up to in that barn, it'd be him. I waited 3 days, just to be sure no one had seen me moving around the truck more than usual. Then, early one morning, before the sun had fully stretched across the skyline, I drove to the edge of town and parked behind the boarded-up bait shop across from Calder's house. He opened the door like he'd been expecting me. "Sadie," he said, tilting his head, his eyes narrowing just a little like he was trying to recognize someone after too many birthdays had passed. "Well, ain't seen you since—" "I know," I said gently. "I wouldn't come if it wasn't important." He motioned me inside. The kitchen was clean, modest. A single cup of coffee sat steaming on the counter. "I don't have much time," I said. "I need you to look at something for me." From my pocket, I pulled the jagged strip I'd pried from the inner frame beneath the door. It was small, no bigger than a stick of gum, but heavy. I wrapped it in an old napkin and placed it on the table like I was laying down a live wire. Calder didn't touch it at first. He just stared. Then, slowly, he reached for his reading glasses, perched them on the bridge of his nose, and lifted the piece into the light. After a long pause, he let out a low whistle. "I'll be damned," he muttered, turning it over. "You know what this is?" "I have a guess," I said. "But I need to hear it from someone who actually knows." Calder set the piece down and folded his arms. "Your grandfather ever tell you how he used to hide things? Not just physically, but in plain sight?" I nodded. "He used to say, the best place to hide a treasure is where no one would ever think to look for it." He chuckled, low and rough. "Sounds like him." I sat down across from him, my knees weak. "I think it's gold, Calder. Real gold. And not just a layer. I think the truck might be built with it, or lined at least." He didn't laugh, didn't scoff. He just looked down at the metal again. "Your grandfather told me once, years ago, back when we were closing down the old shop, he said, 'That truck carries the family's real future.' I thought he was talking about sentiment, memories. Hell, I didn't think twice about it." He leaned back in his chair and looked at me. Maybe he meant it literally. I exhaled slowly, the pressure in my chest loosening just a bit. "I don't want anyone to know," I said. "Not yet, especially not her." "You mean Seraphine?" I nodded. Calder shook his head. "She always wanted the spotlight, that one. Your grandpa knew it. That's why he gave her what looked flashy, but left the real thing to the one who'd look past the surface." I blinked back something that felt too close to tears. "That truck's not just rust and bolts," Calder said, pushing the metal back toward me. "It's trust." I wrapped the piece carefully and tucked it back into my jacket. When I stood, he stood too. "If you need help," he said, "you come to me, quietly." "I will," I promised. "Thank you." The drive back was quiet. Micah was still asleep when I climbed into the truck. I pulled the blanket over his shoulder, then pulled the glove compartment open and hid the gold strip beneath an old map of Oklahoma. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't shiver or feel sorry for myself. I just sat there in the dark, my hands resting on the steering wheel, and whispered to no one, "This stays between me and him." The shame they gave me had turned into something else, something silent, something sharp. For the first time since the will was read, I felt like I wasn't losing, I was waiting. It started with a flyer. I found it wedged under the truck's wiper blade on a Thursday morning, flapping lightly in the breeze like it was taunting me. An invitation, hand-lettered in pink script with gold trim. Carter Family Brunch, celebrating the success of Seraphine's new storefront and business expansion. Below the title was a smiling photo of Seraphine and her husband posed in front of a recently renovated brick building downtown. I stared at it longer than I should have. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe pride still had a little grip on me, whispering that I should show up just to prove I wasn't broken. Maybe I just wanted to see who else had moved on without me. I didn't dress fancy. I didn't bother with makeup. I wore clean jeans, a faded blue shirt, and tied my hair back. Micah stayed home with Calder, who offered before I even asked. "Ain't no place for a boy," he said with a grim look. "This ain't a brunch, it's a parade." He wasn't wrong. When I pulled into the country club parking lot, the place was packed. SUVs, convertibles, and imported cars lined the circular drive like showroom models. Everyone looked polished, rehearsed. The kind of people who kept a second set of silverware just for holidays and smiled with their teeth only. I walked in through the side entrance and made my way to the outdoor garden where the brunch was being held. String lights hung from the trees, tables draped in linen, mimosas flowing. Someone played acoustic guitar near a barista cart, and every few minutes, a round of polite laughter would float across the lawn. And there she was, center stage, as always. Seraphine wore a cream-colored wrap dress that hugged her like it had been stitched onto her that morning. Her hair was perfect, nails like painted glass. She moved from group to group like a politician, all smiles and shoulder touches, as if she hadn't thrown me into a ditch just weeks earlier. A woman leaned in to hug her and asked, "What's next for you, Seraphine? First the boutique, now this new line of eco-candles?" "Oh, you know me," she said with a breezy laugh. "Some of us were just born to build." That line hit me harder than I expected. Some of us were just born to build. I wasn't even sure she remembered she had a sister when she said it. That was the part that stung the most. She didn't even need to look me in the eye anymore to erase me. She'd already done it. I kept walking, drifting between tables, dodging the eyes of cousins and in-laws. No one said hello. No one asked why I was there. It was like I'd turned invisible the moment I stepped onto the patio. Later, when most of the guests were too busy posing for selfies near the cake table to notice, I slipped into the main house. The foyer was filled with flowers and gift baskets, the scent of vanilla and roses nearly overwhelming. I paused near the staircase, letting my gaze drift toward the gallery wall Seraphine had installed a few years ago. It was her version of a family tree, dozens of framed photographs arranged in perfect rows, formal portraits, holiday candids, backyard birthday parties. I scanned the wall, one frame at a time, and stopped cold halfway down. There was a new centerpiece photo, blown up larger than the rest. The whole family stood shoulder to shoulder, Seraphine, mom and dad, a few cousins, even the great aunt no one liked talking to, everyone smiling, everyone dressed in coordinated pastel tones, everyone but me. I wasn't in the photo, not even in the background, not cropped out, just not there. My mouth went dry. I took a step closer, looking for any sign that I'd been forgotten by accident. "Printer must have skipped you," Seraphine said casually from the hallway. I turned slowly. She held a glass of lemonade in her hand, her tone light, unbothered, like she was commenting on the weather. "Oops," my jaw tightened. "You've made your point." She smiled wider, shrugged. "What point? It's not my fault you keep disappearing." For a second, I thought about smashing the glass in her hand, not because of the picture, not because of the party, but because she said it like it was true, like I had done this to myself. I didn't say another word. I walked out, down the hall, past the guests, and back to the truck. By the time I turned onto the old highway heading west, the sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the road. The hum of the tires gave my thoughts room to breathe, and in that silence, the truth settled in. They had erased me. Not just from a picture, from the story, from the narrative they'd built where Seraphine was the shining star and I was the footnote they'd long since edited out. But gold doesn't vanish. It doesn't rust, not really. It waits. And when the light hits it just right, it shines so bright, it's blinding. That night, after putting Micah to bed, I sat behind the wheel of Grandpa's truck again. I held the keys in my hand, turned them slowly between my fingers, thinking about the shimmer I'd uncovered under the rust, thinking about Calder's words, thinking about the strip of gold hidden beneath the old road map in the glove box. It wasn't just metal. It was a promise, a legacy. I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the cracked windshield ahead of me. The engine hadn't turned over in weeks, but I didn't need it to start tonight. I just needed to remember what was mine. If they wanted me erased, I whispered to the darkness, I would make sure I became unforgettable. I didn't sleep much after the brunch, not because I was angry. Anger had passed. What I felt now was colder, quieter, like standing alone in a frozen field, listening for something that wouldn't come. I lay in the back of the truck next to Micah, watching his chest rise and fall, thinking about the photo on the wall. The one I wasn't in. The one where Seraphine smiled like she'd already buried me. If they wanted me erased, I'd make damn sure I left a mark that didn't fade. The next evening, I found myself pulling up the floor mat in the back of the truck. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe just a distraction. Maybe some lost bolt from Grandpa's old toolbox. Maybe nothing. But when my hand brushed against something hard and cold beneath the carpet lining, I froze. It wasn't a part of the truck. It was separate, small and square. I pushed back the rubber mat and reached into the narrow space behind the seat, my fingers finding the edge of a box. It scraped against metal as I pulled it free. The thing was caked in rust and grime, but unmistakably a lockbox. No key. I took a flathead screwdriver from my emergency kit and wedged it into the seam, working it slowly, praying I didn't break whatever was inside. After a minute of steady pressure and a frustrated grunt or two, the latch gave way with a sharp click. Inside were papers, dozens of them, folded, yellowed, some bound together with twine. I sat back, stunned. Under the glow of my phone's flashlight, I unfolded the top sheet. It was a deed. Grandpa's name signed at the bottom, dated just 6 months before he passed. It transferred ownership of a parcel of land near Highway 61, land I didn't even know he still owned. The next bundle was labeled Carter Holdings, Inc., with attached documentation, minutes from meetings, original stock certificates, shares, all in his handwriting, all assigned to me. My hands began to shake. I flipped through them one by one, my eyes blurring. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a forgotten box. He had done this on purpose. Every legal document, every note, every signature had my name on it. The truck wasn't a joke. It was a message. He had trusted me, not Seraphine, not the family that lined up for pieces of him before the funeral dirt had settled. Me. I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth, trying to steady my breath. My chest ached in a new way, raw, but no longer hollow. "Grandpa," I whispered, "you didn't forget me. You didn't leave me behind." The next morning, I drove into town with the box tucked safely beneath the passenger seat. I stopped at a quiet pawn shop on 3rd Street and sold a tiny sliver of gold I'd peeled from the truck's underframe the week before. It was enough to get me started, barely, but enough. I knew what I needed to do. By the end of the week, I found an old run-down garage for rent at the edge of Main Street. The windows were cracked, the floor was stained with oil and neglect, and the last tenant had left behind a pile of broken furniture. But the bones were solid. I could work with it. I took a photo of the building and printed out a piece of paper in the public library's computer lab. It read, "Rust to Rise, Auto Repairs. Restorations." Underneath the name, I sketched a simple outline of Grandpa's truck in gold ink. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. I pinned the paper inside the dusty window and started sweeping. The days that followed were long and brutal. I painted, scrubbed, fixed the broken hydraulic lift with a part I'd salvaged from a junkyard. Calder dropped by with an old radio and a jug of iced tea. "You're stubborn," he said with a crooked smile. "Your grandpa would have been proud." I smiled back. "He better be. He left me with nothing but rust." He laughed, patted the front counter and said, "Nothing but rust and a legacy." We didn't talk about Seraphine, not directly, but I knew the moment she found out. It was a Tuesday morning, clear sky and good breeze. I was setting up the tire racks when her Range Rover crept past the shop. She didn't stop, just slowed down, sunglasses on, lips pursed like she'd bitten into something sour. I didn't wave, I didn't smile, I just kept stacking tires, because I was done shrinking. By the end of that month, I had my first paying customer. A retired teacher named Mr. Dawson who needed his battery replaced. Then came a single mom with a flat. Then a middle-aged man who said, "I heard you used to work with Carter's old crew. That true?" "I learned from the best," I said simply, and meant it. I didn't rush. I didn't try to grow too fast. Every dollar went back into the shop. I bought better tools. I replaced the flickering light above the entry. I even found a bench to place out front so folks could sit while they waited. Each night, I locked up the garage and walked across the street to the truck. Micah would be inside with his homework spread across the back seat, earbuds in. He always looked up when I opened the door, eyes bright. "You tired?" he'd ask. "Not tired," I'd say. "Just ready." He didn't understand the difference yet, but he would. One evening, while I was locking up, Calder showed up again, holding a can of paint. "What's this for?" I asked. He winked. "For the truck." I shook my head. "It's not time yet." He studied me, thoughtful. "You're still waiting." "Yeah," I said. "But not forever." That night, as I sat behind the wheel of the truck, my hands aching from work, my heart surprisingly steady, I thought about everything I'd built from the ashes of humiliation. Every bolt tightened was a piece of my backbone growing back. Every repair was a promise I made to myself. Every time someone trusted me with their car, their time, their money, I took it as proof that I was still here, still standing, still valuable, because every screw I turned wasn't just fixing cars, it was fixing me. It didn't take long. I'd barely settled into a rhythm at the shop, sweeping before dawn, wiping grease off my hands between customers, learning which parts suppliers wouldn't ask too many questions about cash payments before the whispers started. Not about me, about her. Calder was the first to mention it. He stopped by one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe with a paper bag full of brake pads and a subtle gleam in his eyes. "Seraphine's got herself in a mess," he said casually, like he was commenting on the weather. I didn't bite, not at first. He continued anyway. "You know that big new office she opened on 3rd? Word is she can't pay the contractor. They halted the plumbing last week, half-finished work and no inspection passed." I kept organizing my socket wrenches, pretending I wasn't listening, but I was. "She's overextended," he added. Again. It wasn't just the office. Over the next couple of weeks, more stories floated through town, through customers, through the woman who ran the sandwich shop down the block, even through Micah's teacher, who mentioned offhandedly that the PTA had been trying to get Seraphine to pay her promised donation for months. "Maybe she forgot," the teacher said, smiling too tight, "but she's usually so visible." Visible. That was the word. Seraphine lived for visibility, for applause. For the curated photo, the perfectly chosen quote, the impression of having it all, but behind the filters and matching outfits, the seams were coming undone. I drove past her boutique one afternoon after finishing a brake line job. The grand reopening banner was still hanging limp over the entry, sun-bleached and curling at the corners. A young man, probably no older than 20, stood on the sidewalk yelling into a phone. "She said the check would clear. I'm not doing another day's work until we get paid." I parked a few blocks away and walked into the coffee shop across the street, ordered a tea, and sat near the window, just watching. Seraphine pulled up 15 minutes later in her white SUV. She stepped out, heels clicking, hair flawless. She barely looked at the man still pacing near the door. She adjusted her sunglasses, smiled at someone she recognized across the street, and posed as if a camera might be watching, even though none was. She was performing. Always had been. But this time, it looked like even she didn't believe her own act anymore. A few days later, as the August heat pressed against the sidewalks and made every engine work twice as hard, Calder showed up at the garage with someone I hadn't seen in years. "Sadie," Calder said, holding the door open, "you remember Emmett Morris?" The man behind him stepped forward, older now, slower, with a cane in one hand and deep lines across his face. His overalls still had the faint outline of a name tag long since worn away. "Your grandpa and I used to work the line together back in the old Carter warehouse," he said with a kind smile. "Didn't know you had your own shop now." I offered him a seat and a glass of water, and we all settled into the small office in the back, where the air conditioner struggled but tried its best. "I came across something," I told him after a few minutes of polite catch-up. "In the truck. Something I wasn't sure I'd ever understand." I pulled out the folder, carefully organized now, of Grandpa's papers, the ones from the lockbox. Emmett looked through them slowly, nodding. When he reached the deed and saw my name written beside Grandpa's, he paused. "I remember when he first started talking about it," he said. "That old truck. Said he was going to pour everything he had left into something no one else could touch. Said he'd already given the shiny stuff to folks who wanted shine, But the truck? That was for the one who saw value under the dirt. He looked up at me, eyes steady. He meant you. My throat tightened. I nodded slowly. He told me, Emmett went on, that it wasn't just about the metal or the land or even the truck. It was about giving you something they couldn't fake, legacy, the kind that doesn't need a hashtag. Calder smiled at that. Told you, didn't I? I sat there, quiet for a moment, letting it sink in. I'd spent so much time wondering if I was imagining the meaning behind Grandpa's gift, if I'd created a story just to protect myself. But now, hearing it from someone who'd worked by his side, it felt real, tangible. He made sure I couldn't be erased, I said softly. Emmett nodded. No, ma'am. He made sure you'd outlast them. After they left, I locked the office door and sat with the papers spread in front of me. I ran my fingers over the signatures, the seals, the deliberate care Grandpa had taken to leave something that couldn't be spun, couldn't be faked, couldn't be polished for Instagram. That night, as I swept the shop floor and put away the tools, I noticed how quiet my thoughts had become. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't replaying every insult. I wasn't waiting for the next blow. I was simply existing, calmly. There was strength in that. I leaned against the garage door, the evening sun casting long shadows across the lot, and closed my eyes. For years, I whispered to myself, I thought silence meant weakness. But now I see, it's the weight of patience, and patience is turning into power. The next day, I had 2 more walk-ins, a man who needed a new alternator, and a woman who didn't know why her engine light was on. I didn't fix their lives. I didn't wave a wand, I just did the work. One bolt at a time, one calloused hand after another. And as I pulled down the bay door that night, listening to the heavy rattle of metal settling into place, I felt it. The shift. I was no longer reacting to what Seraphine did. I was building something she couldn't touch. Seraphine could feel her crown slipping, and I knew she'd come for me before it fell. The next morning came hot and breathless. Tulsa's August sun had no mercy, especially when it settled low and heavy over cracked pavement and tin roofs. By noon, the air in my shop clung to my skin, thick and unforgiving. The fan above my desk hummed and clicked, failing to do much more than move the heat from one corner to another. I spent the day with my head down, fixing a leaking transmission and replacing brake pads for a woman who said she'd followed the smell of grease and honesty. Her words, not mine. By the time the sun dipped behind the neighboring buildings and the shop took on that familiar quiet of a day well spent, I was closing the register and wiping oil off my hands when I heard it. The door slammed. It wasn't just a push. It was a statement. I turned, rag still in hand. And there she was, Seraphine, standing in the doorway of my shop like she owned it. Still dressed to impress, though the sheen of wealth had begun to dull around the edges. Her lipstick was slightly smeared, her heels dusted from the gravel outside. But her posture, rigid, angry. "Congratulations," she said, her voice sharp and brittle. "Your little garage is the talk of Main Street." I didn't respond, just walked to the back wall and began organizing tools I'd already organized that morning. She didn't wait for permission to keep going. "You've been parading around like some underdog hero," she sneered. "Everyone's acting like you built this from nothing, but you didn't, Sadie. You stole it." That stopped me. I turned slowly and met her eyes. "Stole?" She took a step closer, her breath catching. "You took what was supposed to be mine. That truck, that land, those papers." Grandpa was confused. He was old. "He wasn't confused," I said calmly. Seraphine's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You think he loved you more?" Her voice cracked. "You think you were special?" She spat, tears beginning to pool, thick with frustration. "You think helping him change his oil once a week gave you the right to everything?" She was unraveling. Ever since we were kids, it was always about poor little Sadie. You didn't have the looks, the grades, the ambition, but somehow everyone always pitied you. And Grandpa? He treated you like you were some delicate project. You don't get to build a kingdom off of his pity. I folded my arms, letting her words bounce off me like hail on steel. "You were never going to be more than the girl who peeked in a shop apron," she continued. You're not like me. You're right, I said softly. She blinked, surprised. I'm not like you. That hung in the air for a moment, until her body gave out beneath the weight of it all. She dropped onto the chair near the register, heels thudding against the concrete. Her head hung low, and her shoulders trembled. When she looked up, the fire in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by something desperate and raw. We're sisters, she whispered. You can't just turn your back on that. I made mistakes. But you don't have to make it worse. Her mascara was streaked now, black lines dragging beneath her eyes. I've lost everything, she said. You wouldn't let me lose everything, would you? She was still performing, still trying to spin vulnerability into guilt, hoping I'd reach across the table and save her from the consequences of her own ambition. I didn't move. I didn't speak. She stared at me, waiting, but I had nothing to offer. Not this time. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy. Eventually, she rose to her feet, fixing her jacket like she could somehow reassemble herself by straightening a seam. She didn't say goodbye. The door slammed behind her just as hard as it had when she entered. I stood there for a long while, listening to the hum of the overhead lights, the quiet rattle of tools settling in drawers. My heart thudded slow and steady in my chest. All my life, she wanted me erased. She treated me like a typo in her perfect script, something to be redacted or rewritten. Now she wanted mercy, but what she didn't know, what she couldn't understand, was that mercy was no longer mine to give. I'd already made my choice. That night, I closed the shop and walked across the lot to the truck. Micah was curled up in the front seat, watching a movie on my phone with one earbud in. He looked up and smiled. I kissed the top of his head and slid into the driver's seat, the leather warm beneath me. I stared through the windshield, into the soft gold of twilight, the horizon stretching wide and empty in front of me. The next time she walked through my door, I would not be silent. She returned on a Wednesday afternoon, just after I'd finished helping a young couple whose car wouldn't shift into reverse. Calder was leaning by the garage door, sipping his iced tea like always, nodding as I handed the couple their receipt and waved them off. Then Seraphine walked in, not storming this time. No drama, no stomping heels. She moved like someone who was trying very hard to look composed while falling apart from the inside out. Her hair was still curled, but not freshly. Her blouse looked expensive but wrinkled. Her eyes were hidden behind designer sunglasses, but her mouth had no smile left. Calder noticed her first, his posture stiffening. He didn't say a word, just nodded once at me and quietly slipped into the back. She stopped in front of the counter where I was sorting invoices and cleared her throat. We need to talk, she said. I didn't look up, just reached for a roll of ribbon to finish tying up a customer's receipt. I was careful with the knot, precise. Then I slid the paper across the counter and looked at her. This home, I said softly but clearly, was built on respect and love. She blinked, unsure of where I was going. 2 things you never gave me. Her jaw clenched. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence in the room did all the heavy lifting. She looked around as if someone might come to her defense, as if someone, anyone, would swoop in and say, "Come on, Sadie, don't be like that." But no one did. I went back to my papers, not to be cruel, but because it was done, because I didn't need to yell to be heard anymore. She stood there for a moment, swallowing whatever last thread of pride she had left, then turned around and walked out without another word. Her heels tapped across the concrete like they weren't even sure where to go next. The door shut behind her, and Calder peeked back in. "Well," he said after a moment. That sounded final. I didn't answer, just nodded and exhaled slowly, the way you do when something heavy finally leaves the room. In the weeks that followed, the energy shifted. I'd been saving money quietly, working evenings and weekends, doing oil changes, patching tires, diagnosing bad alternators. Most of the town still called me the Carter girl out of habit, but now it came with a different tone. Respectful, curious. I decided to do something with the truck. Not just hide it in the back anymore. Not just keep it as a relic of pain or pride. I repainted it. Took my time with it, too. Sanded the rust slowly, layer by layer, like I was peeling away every insult, every eye roll, every time I'd been overlooked. I buffed the metal until my fingers ached. sprayed a matte coat in a deep, smoky silver, left one strip of raw gold exposed along the bottom panel, just enough to catch the light and hint at the truth underneath. And on the driver's door, I painted a logo, a golden outline of the truck with Grandpa's initials inside it. It wasn't a restoration, it was a transformation. Once it was ready, I started using it as a mobile help center. Micah and I packed fresh groceries in the back on Saturday mornings, delivered to older folks who couldn't drive. Calder built a fold-out step for kids to hop into the truck bed when we handed out backpacks before school. A retired teacher down the street helped organize a book swap. A local mechanic who used to work for my dad donated tires. And people noticed, not because of the paint or the logo, but because the truck kept showing up, reliable, steady, quiet, just like I'd always been. At the fall community picnic, they asked me to park it by the food tents. I was hesitant at first, but when I arrived, I saw a small crowd already waiting. Someone had printed flyers, Rust to Rise, community truck. Micah handed out water bottles while I answered questions. One man clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You did more with that old truck than anyone thought possible. You turned rust into gold." I smiled and shook his hand. My fingers were still stained with grease from the morning shift. Across the field, I caught a glimpse of Seraphine. She was standing near the edge, not dressed for photos this time, just a plain blouse and jeans. Her hair was up in a loose ponytail, no makeup that I could see. She clutched her purse tightly, eyes scanning the crowd but not landing anywhere. When our eyes met, she didn't look away. She didn't smile either. She just nodded once, tired, almost grateful, and turned to leave. I didn't call after her, didn't run, didn't chase, didn't gloat. I just watched her walk away, swallowed by the crowd. Later that night, when the picnic was over and Micah was asleep in the truck, I sat on the tailgate and let the breeze cool the sweat on the back of my neck. The lights from the field faded one by one, leaving just the soft hum of insects and the distant echo of laughter. I looked at the logo on the side of the truck, ran my hand across the outline of Grandpa's initials. "She wanted me erased," I said aloud to no one in particular. But instead, I became a story this town will never forget. And yet, her fall wasn't finished. It was only beginning, because when pride collapses, it never falls quietly. Word travels fast in a small town, faster when it involves a Carter, and lightning fast when it's the Carter everyone once assumed had it all. I heard about the auction before she did. Seraphine's house, our parents' old home turned suburban estate with white pillars and custom glass doors, was officially foreclosed. The banks were tired of playing games, and the mortgage had gone unpaid for months. Her name had quietly disappeared from the real estate office downtown. I saw the sign come down myself, early one morning while I sipped coffee outside the garage. One guy on a ladder. No fuss, no ceremony, just another chapter closed. It was a Tuesday when I finally saw her again, and by then, the cracks were no longer subtle. She showed up around dusk, walking this time. No SUV, no heels. Her hair pulled back in a messy twist that hadn't seen a brush in a day or two. Clothes wrinkled, face bare, the look of someone who had stopped pretending they were fine, but still hadn't figured out what came next. I was standing outside the garage, closing the hood on a car I'd just finished. Micah was inside, working on his spelling homework, the sound of country music low on the radio behind him. She didn't ask if she could approach. She just stood there, not quite on the gravel, not quite on the sidewalk, in between, always in between. "I don't have anywhere else," she said after a long pause. "I've tried everything. I just need a place, just for a few days, till I figure things out." I didn't respond right away. I wiped my hands on a rag, looked at her, really looked at her. This wasn't the woman who'd mocked me at the will reading, not the one who'd driven past me in a Range Rover while I lived out of a truck. This was someone else now, smaller somehow, but still clinging to the hope that I'd forget. "Please, Sadie," she whispered. "Just let me stay with you. Just for a while." I stepped closer, not out of sympathy, but because I wanted her to hear me clearly. "I gave you silence," I said, "when you tried to erase me. I let you tell your version of everything, paint your picture, and lock me out of it." She lowered her eyes. "But now," I continued, I give you something better. Her head tilted, uncertain. I give you freedom, to live without me. I walked past her, opened the garage door, and didn't look back. A few minutes later, when I stepped outside again to lock up for the night, she was gone. The next day, a neighbor told me she'd been seen at the church shelter. A few nights later, someone said she'd asked about a job at the diner on the corner of 5th and Elm. I didn't follow up. I didn't need to. What happened next wasn't about her anymore. It was about what I was still building. The truck, Grandpa's truck, sat in front of the shop, its new paint already a little dusty. The gold trim along the bottom edge caught the morning sun just right. It didn't gleam. It glowed. That Saturday, I woke early, baked muffins with Micah, packed water bottles in the cooler, and filled the truck bed with bags of donated food from the corner grocery. We made 3 stops that morning, one to Miss Dottie on Sycamore Street, one to the Johnson twins whose mom was recovering from surgery, and one to a family I didn't know well, but knew needed help. Every place we stopped, Micah smiled and waved. The truck turned heads, not because it was flashy, but because it had a purpose. We parked outside the town hall around noon. The summer festival was just beginning, booths lining the sidewalk, balloons tied to folding chairs, music played from someone's portable speaker, and the scent of kettle corn and grilled sausage filled the air. Calder met us there with a folding sign he'd made himself. He smiled wide as he set it down beside the truck. Rust to Rise, community truck, free rides, free meals, real talk. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I just gave him a side hug and said, "You really think of everything." Townsfolk gathered. Some asked about the logo on the side. I told them the story, not the full one, not yet, just enough to make them smile and nod. "That's the girl who turned rust into gold," one man said to his wife as he pointed at the truck. I heard her whisper, "Good for her, about time." Micah stood in the back, arms out, balancing like he was on a surfboard. He waved at someone across the lot, his grin wide and proud. I caught my breath for a moment, and in that stillness, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It wasn't even about proving Seraphine wrong. It was about proving Grandpa right. He hadn't left me a rusty truck as a joke or a burden. He'd given me the only thing they couldn't take. A legacy hidden in plain sight. A foundation disguised as scrap. That afternoon, after the festival wrapped and the sun started its slow descent, I walked back to the truck, placed a bouquet of wildflowers in the bed, sunflowers, daisies, and one golden lily, and stood there for a while, watching the petals shift in the breeze. People came and went. Some offered thanks. Some just nodded. One boy walked up, touched the side of the truck gently, and said, "I want to build something like this when I grow up." I knelt down and smiled. "You will. Start small. Start with what everyone else ignores." Later, as twilight dipped the town in purple and gold, I climbed into the driver's seat with Micah by my side. He rested his head on my shoulder, and I brushed a strand of hair from his eyes. "This wasn't just Grandpa's gift," I whispered. "It was his trust. And I finally proved him right." I turned the key. The engine purred like it had always meant to run forever. They tried to bury me in rust, but Grandpa knew there was gold underneath all along. Sometimes, what looks like the smallest inheritance can hold the greatest legacy. Sadie's story reminds us that dignity, resilience, and quiet strength often outlast noise, wealth, and show. Not every revenge story needs to be loud. Sometimes, the most powerful justice is simply rising when no one thought you would. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? What did you do about it? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We've got more powerful, real-life inspired stories waiting for you.